Okay, welcome back. This is the review for the final exam. It's going to work just like the midterm, so we're going to speed through a little bit of the bulk part. There's a little note here I put in that I have to turn in your grades essentially next Monday, okay? Which means I'm going to wake up Monday morning, grade your finals, and then post your final course grades into the electronic system. So you absolutely, positively cannot be late turning in your final exam. Okay? Okay. Cool. Let's continue. So here's the list of topics. And just like before, there's going to be a pool of 50. You're going to get 40. Which ones you're going to get, I don't know. What order you're going to get them, I don't know. I've got the page numbers in here, but that don't mean that's where the question came from. It doesn't mean that's where the answers are. They help just to help you study. Okay. So you've heard all that before, right? So let's just go ahead and get started. All right, here's how it works. The first question is talking about PC form factor. You know what I'm talking about. There's like the difference between an all-in-one and a desktop and a tablet and a notebook and a netbook. So I'm going to ask you some of those. Which of the following are true of these form factors? And I think you won't have any trouble with that. The term CPU is often used incorrectly. It's often used to mean the box. It's used to mean lots of things. And so I'm going to ask you, to drill home that point, I'm going to ask you, how is the motherboard related to the CPU, as an example. The next one talks about processor speed. So this is going to be a slightly different question since we've already asked this one several times. So this one's going to be same essential question, but just worded a little differently about, how much of the process, when comparing processors, how much is the processor speed important? How important is that? The next one talks about the difference between volatile and non-volatile memory, and in this scenario, we're not talking about secondary storage. We're only talking about primary storage. And so I may give you one of those, what the heck is the difference? Or I may give you a scenario and ask you, is this volatile or non-volatile? RAM modules, we talked about, SIMs and DIMMs and RAN bus and static SD-RAM and all these kind of things. And I mentioned to you that there's a particular form factor that's typically used like for laptops and things like that. If you remember all that discussion, I think you'd be in good shape. Cache memory, we talked about how this is kind of the bridge between the CPU and main memory, right? And how, the CPUs have gotten faster and faster and faster, and memory has gotten a little bit faster. So they put a cache in between the two. I'm going to ask you some questions about how that works. Nothing technical, but just, where does it fit in the grand scheme of things? Peripheral cards, remember how we talked about, plugging in a video card and how, what's the procedures and, all that kind of stuff. Again, how do peripheral cards work? What are the... what happens when you plug one in, things of that nature. On Chapter 7, it was about input. Remember we talked about, the keyboard has areas, they have data entry, they have, numeric, they have function keys, they have all these things. I'm going to ask you something about, one of those areas, and what the heck does that mean? The next one talks about on-screen keyboard. A lot of people, when they're doing a lot of typing, don't like to use an on-screen keyboard. And so I'm going to ask you some questions along the lines of, what's the problem? Are they just wimpy, or, what's the issue? The next one, we're going to talk about the cursor. I'm going to ask you some about, the origin and, what does it mean and all that kind of, how does it work, those kind of things. Again, it'll be kind of a high-level philosophical thing. I'm not asking you to dip into the weeds on how the cursor on the screen moves about. Pin computing, pin input rather. We talked about how, if you have a tablet with, a pressure-sensitive screen, you could have like pin input, and perhaps there's some alternatives to get that same kind of technology onto other devices, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to ask you a little bit about how pin input works. The next one talks about scanners, and there's a whole bunch of topics associated with scanners. So this is probably going to be one of those, which of the following are true of scanners? And just list a whole bunch of things, and you go through and say yes, no, no, yes, no, yes. Displays. Now the display one, you might have to put your thinking cap on, okay? This is not really a tough question. Not really. It's just you're going to have to thought and think about it. And so I'm going to ask you to think about, dot pitch and things of that nature, okay? Nothing where you had to whoop out a calculator, okay? But again, kind of, well, I'm not saying it's a tough question. Well, I'll just wait and see, won't I? After everybody answers, I'll come back and tell you if it was a tough question or not. Okay. The next one talks about printers, and it'll be one of those, because there's a whole bunch of things about printers. So it'll probably, which of the following are true of printers, And so I'm going to list a whole bunch of things, that, this is more expensive than that, or that's quieter than that, or this consumes more electricity than that, or, whatever. And you can go through and tell me yes, no, no, yes, no. The next one, I put a no next to. I normally don't put no's when you get to the part where there isn't a book, because if there's no book, how in the world can you not have it in the book? But I talked a great deal about the presentation philosophy. Long before we started doing any PowerPoint, I talked about my philosophy about how to do a presentation. If you can remember that, then you'll have no trouble at all in answering this question. We talked about themes in PowerPoint, so I'm going to ask you a little bit about, how do you select a theme, or what's appropriate theme, and those kinds of things. The next one talks about selecting text. I'm going to give you a specific scenario and ask you what happens when you do that. Cool. Bullet list. Remember how we had multiple indentations on a bullet list, and when you change the indentation, other things occur? I'm going to ask you a little bit about what happens when you take a bullet list and grab a chunk of it and change its indentation level. Okay, now we're back to the normal textbook. So chapter 8 was all about, storage, that kind of stuff, remember? So, what's the difference between storage medium and a storage device? That'd be a good question. Low-level format. Remember I talked about how, in the old days, you'd get a disk and you'd have to prep it. And so what does low-level formatting actually mean today? Hard disk characteristics, again, not going to be deep in the weeds, but I'm going to be asking you, simple things like, hard disks have spinning disks, and there are, how many, a track can have multiple sectors, and, faster this means faster that, and, those kind of philosophical, no, they're not philosophical, they're honest to God real characteristics. Anyway, which of the following are true, kind of a thing. Altitude rating. I talked a bit about how traditional hard drives have an altitude rating, and I might ask you why. The next one talks about solid state disk, and again, there was an awful lot about solid state disks, so I'll probably ask which of the following are true. They're more expensive, they're quieter, they're rounder, they're they taste better, whatever. You go through and say yes, yes, no, no, yes, yes. The next one talks about, what kind of a system do I need to be able to create a CDR, or if I have a written CDR disk, what kind of system hardware do I have to be able to read a CDR? So either reading or authoring a CDR. Next talks about the difference between a network attached storage and a storage area network. The difference between a NAS and a SAN. And again, if I ask you which of the, what's the difference between the two, it won't be one of those deep in the weed things. I may ask you, which is the most appropriate for home use or business use, and then ask you why. And so it's kind of sort of the same thing. It's still what's the difference between the two. But again, I'm not talking about getting deep in the weeds. Okay, the next one was talking about Microsoft Excel. I showed you a little trick when you're entering numbers, and I want it to show up as text, not a number. How do I do that? If you can remember that, you'll be able to answer the question. Kind of sort of this next one's kind of sort of the same way. I wanted to automatically adjust the widths of columns, and so how do you do that in bulk? How do I, adjust the width of multiple columns? How does that done? The next one is a formula. Now, I'm not asking you to write a formula, okay? Get that out of your mind. I'm going to give you a formula and say, tell me what this does, or tell me how many rows or how many columns are being operated on by this particular thing. Okay, so once again, you're not going to be writing any Excel formulas here. So it's going to be an example. The next one talks about creating a chart. I cautioned you about when you create a chart, you should do one thing versus another before you get to the insert chart part. And so I'm going to give you that scenario and ask you why that's the case. So once again, if you can remember from lecture, why I select what I did before I go in and hit insert. Okay, back to chapter 9. OS fundamentals. Once again, philosophical. It's going to be, what is an operating system or what's not an operating system. Or I may give you an example and say, is this or is this not a valid example of an operating system? That kind of stuff. The next one talks about sleep states. Remember how when you put your machine to sleep, there's multiple sleep states, and depending on the deeper and deeper you get, the less power it consumes, but it takes longer and longer and longer to return from the sleep state. So if you remember that whole conversation, I think you'd be good to shape. Next it talks about multitasking. That have single tasking operating systems and multitasking operating systems. I gave you some examples of those, and if you can remember those examples, I think you'd be in good shape. Virtual memory. I talked about how a machine that has 4 gig of RAM could actually run applications that require 6 gig of RAM. It's all magic. By using the swap space. And if you can kind of remember how that works, and again, I'm not getting into the weeds on, explain to me how this works, but it's going to be one of those, is this possible, or how do you calculate, how much room you're going to need, those kind of things. The next one is going to be kind of simple, like, what the heck is a device driver? I rarely ask definitions. I often ask, explain what the heck it's used for, but I don't ever actually say define the term. What's the difference between authentication and authorization? Yeah, you kind of sort of need to know the difference between the two. I go into one particular example of Chrome OS. So I'm going to give you a scenario and ask you, is this an appropriate use for Chrome OS, or here's Chrome OS and is this appropriate? The next one is another one of those that's a little tough. Talks about database philosophy. I talked a great deal at the end of the lecture talking about Microsoft Access on why we did what we did. At the first part of the lecture, we did a bunch of stuff. And at the end, I went through it again and said, here's why we did that. And so I want to know if you know why we did what we did. When we, broke things into separate tables, what was the reason we did that? If you can remember that little piece, or big piece of lecture, I think you'd be in good shape. The data hierarchy, talking about, you have characters and characters and fields and rows and tables and databases, that kind of stuff. We talked about in Access, we talked about how you have a key and a primary key out. I may ask you, what on earth is it for? That kind of stuff. Or, how do you make one a primary key? What's the technique to do? What button do I push to make that work? Talk about queries. Remember how we broke things into tables and then we used a query to bolt them back together again? I'm going to ask you some questions. Again, I'm not going to ask you to write a query. No. I'm going to ask you a philosophical question on, what's the query for? How does it work? That kind of stuff. Not build one from scratch. No way. Okay, back to the textbook. I mentioned in lecture that I didn't think their definition of a network was complete. And if you can remember that description in lecture, you'll be able to answer this question. Okay, this is a good place to stop for the 15-minute mark. We only got a couple more to go, so we'll be done here in just a few minutes.